Let me put my timer. Well, good morning. I've met many of you. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Parisa. It's like Paris with an A, which is easy. I'm at Penn State. I like to first acknowledge my collaborators, Jacques Riviere. You have seen him walking with our daughter. So he could have been also presenting here. Chris Marone, that some of you know. Derek Ellsworth, and also my colleagues at LANEL. I haven't named anyone, but this is where I started using nonlinear ultrasonics acoustics. I also like to acknowledge my students, Ji-Young, Clay, and Prabhakaran. The work I'm presenting today is financed by Department of Energy. So we do a lot of work on ultrasonics in Penn State Ultrasonics Lab, Pencil you see here. But I'm going to focus this particular talk on only the work that we have been doing in the last couple of years on intact and fractured rocks, because I thought this is what is of interest to you, and Celine and Christophe asked me to talk about that. And I want to thank them both for inviting me, thank Philip also for organizing. I also have a special thank to 4 people who ran with me this morning, Cheers, Richard, Peter, and Andre, for slowing down. This was a great workout for me. I know it wasn't for you, but thank you for doing that. So with that introduction, I thought I should have a map here. You're all, most of you seismologists. This is not a seismic station. This is the location of my university in the United States. It is in the middle of Pennsylvania, and this is how it looks like. It's a beautiful place, nice terrains. It's forest pretty much. And something remarkable about this university, besides ultrasonic research, is its very big football stadium with 106,500 people. According to Jacques, it's bigger than any stadium in France. It's according to him, but this is what I've heard. So with that introduction, let me start my scientific talk. And I want you to raise your hand and ask questions, because this is a little bit outside of some of the domains that you are working on, and I've targeted it for the students present here. So I like you to ask questions. I first want to kind of talk about what you have seen in this workshop, that a lot of phenomenon that we have been observing, it's being observed across length scale. So you go from millimeter size, all the microns actually, all the way to Earth. So starting with non-destructive evaluation and medical ultrasound, structural health monitoring, and then applications such as fracking, and then the Earth. So we have non-destructive evaluation. You can have, reservoirs or geotechnical applications, and one thing that you are all very familiar with, seismometers. So it turns out that understanding the nonlinear elasticity of materials has implications in a lot of different fields. Non-destructive evaluation is one of them. So this graph, I like it because you can see we use it for incipient damage, early damage. So if the damage scale is very small, in the order of microns, you cannot use conventional methods. Some of them Ans was talking about. You cannot use reflection to detect those. So you have to use some more advanced topics, some more advanced methods. We also can use it for materials characterization. And in fact, if I'm honest with you, a lot of my work, you see some of just recent ones here, has something to do with that in other materials. But I promise you today, I'm only talking about rocks here. So you can use nonlinear elastic behavior to characterize rocks. This is from one of the early papers I've been involved in, where you can see the nonlinear response of these different materials, mortar, sandstone, granite, and you can see how different it looks. And one of my objectives today is that you understand these plots, what this actually means. I also want to touch upon another thing, another aspect that this is useful for. And Christophe in his talk touched upon that. So it turns out that when you have distant earthquakes, they cause changes in permeability, transient changes, and recovery. And when I saw these, I thought about, what I've seen in seismology papers that you have written, and they look awfully similar. So you have the same kind of transience and recovery. So in the lab, we tried to emulate these phenomenon, and we found a relationship. I'm not talking about that in this talk, but there is a GRL 2020 and a JGR 2021 paper from my group that if you're interested in this topic, you can take a look. It turns out that these phenomena are actually dependent. So you can actually connect them to each other. Also, I'm not talking about it today. Now, you all have seen this, so I'm not talking about what we are looking here, but you haven't seen this one. So we have this phenomenon in the Earth scale. So this is an experiment we did over Thanksgiving break in 2016. So you have a piece of rock, it's broken, it has a fracture plane, and we just hit it with a hammer. And you can see when the rock was intact, you still see this time delay and recovery looks awfully similar to the left-hand side. And then when it is fractured, this becomes exaggerated. It turns out that this is even more complicated. So if I press the rock at different stresses, I'm going to see different behavior. And I'm going to show you that this is even much more complicated than I'm showing you here. The stress and in situ condition has a great impact on this nonlinearity. So with that motivation, I hope I haven't lost you. I'm going to talk today about laboratory scale experiments that we do to try to understand the phenomenon that you are all studying and I've been learning from you this week and through your publications. So with this motivation, I want to kind of tell you what I have planned to talk about. First, I want to just go through the principles of nonlinear elasticity and how it relates to the ultrasonic and acoustic and seismic measurements, depending on what frequency you are working on. Then I'm going to talk about dynamic acoustoelastic testing, because this is what is kind of more similar to the phenomenon that you observe in the field. And I'm not going to just talk about specimens which are just nicely, disposable. I'm also going to talk about these measurements under stress, which is, I think, we have a pretty nice setup, which I want to show you. And if we have time, I'd like to show you some other cool stuff that we have been working on, because we are still trying to understand what is going on. So, and you promise that you raise your hand if any of this becomes too complicated. Let's just start with the basics. What is linear, nonlinear? Whenever you talk about nonlinear, it has to be nonlinear in something. So we are talking about a stress-strain relationship. If you look at the stress-strain relationship at a small strains, if you have a very small amplitude wave, you are probing the linear portion of the stress-strain relationship. You all know that wave speed is a strain independent, right? It's only a function of stiffness and density. That's what we know. What happens when you change the volume and send a wave which has a larger amplitude? For reflection and transmission, nothing much happens. If you think about the principles, they are not strain dependent, right? But what makes a big difference is when you have intergrain boundaries, or when you have cracks which are very small, if you manage to have enough amplitude to change their state, like to make them close and open, to make them slide against each other, then you are going to make a difference. And this is kind of the principle of nonlinear ultrasonics. So if you go to the nonlinear regime in a very simple way, you can see that in the tension phase, the stiffness, the slope, is smaller than the compression phase. What is the implication when you send the waveform in? It gets distorted. So the tension phase is traveling with a smaller speed than the compression phase. So it starts to look funny. It doesn't look sinusoidal anymore. What does it mean in terms of characteristic? If you send a wave with a frequency f, you are going to get frequencies at 2f, 3f, 4f. This is what we call higher harmonics. Now, this is what I just was talking to you about. So on one side, you have a stress-strain curve. Then you look at the derivative. You have modulus versus a strain. Then you are looking at a spectrum, right? If you have linear, you send F, you get F. If you have nonlinearity in the form of modulus being linearly depending on a strain, you get this parameter beta, and you get a second harmonic. If you have a little bit more nonlinearity in the second order, you are going to get a modulus looking like that, and you are going to get a third harmonic. You have heard this being talked about a few times in this meeting. This is what we call classical nonlinearity. This has been studied in metals since 1950s. It's very well known. But then you have hysteresis in a stress-strain relation, which is very important to this community in geomaterials. And you're going to see this funny shape, kind of bow tie shape for modulus. And this is how we describe it using some of the more common models. And this is called non-classical hysteretic nonlinearity. So that's about linear and nonlinear. You can always ask questions. But how do we measure them? So you go to the lab, you want to measure beta. The way people do it, you basically send a large amplitude wave of frequency f, and you are really looking at the amplitude at the second harmonic. And it turns out that if you look at the slope of the amplitude at second harmonic to the square of fundamental, this is proportional to beta. Why seismologists or people who work in rock mechanics don't use it? Because attenuation, we have been ignoring, plays an important role. It's very hard to measure high harmonics in geomaterials. So it's not really, this is not something that is very relevant here. There is another method which can just gives us this alpha, this non-classical nonlinearity. And this is called nonlinear resonant spectroscopy. And it is very simple. So let me show you how it works. Basically, you try to resonate the material at a particular mode, and you just increase the amplitude. And it turns out that the frequency, if the material has hysteretic nonlinearity, the frequency is going to shift, becomes smaller and smaller linearly, and this slope gives you alpha. And people have done this, I think in IPGP, it's one of the first experiments. Sorry, I don't have the references written here, but they have done it in geomaterials. It's something that people use, and we have also used it for other materials too. What does it mean, this alpha? Just roughly speaking, if you have larger nonlinearity, you have larger damage. So what is damage depends on who you are asking for. It could be a fault, it could be microcrack, it could be something else. So now, wouldn't it be nice if we could recover the elastic modulus versus the strain, the whole spectrum of these behaviors? It turns out that there is a method which gives us all of these. It gives us the classical and non-classical nonlinearity, and this is called DAT. And that's what I'm going to focus my talk today about. I thought that would be the focus. So I hope the introduction is clear so far. So what is dynamic acousto-elastic testing? You have been seeing this in this conference. It is a pump and probe approach. What do we mean by pump and probe? So here the pump is in blue and the probe is in orange. The pump is a high amplitude, low frequency pump, and the probe has frequency much higher, and the amplitude is small, so it doesn't induce additional nonlinearity. So if you look at the pump and probe superimposed, it should look something like that. Now, how does this work? Basically, you excite the sample. We typically use resonance because of convenience, because it creates a lot of amplitude without putting in a lot of voltage, but this is not necessary. So you excite the sample, and then you measure, at the same time, you are measuring the wave speed as you are all showing. Sorry, I want to go through this once again. So you measure the wave speed, and then if you plot the change in wave speed, now you all use dv over v naught. Sorry, I use delta c over c naught. You'll see for a reason a little bit later. And then if you plot them versus each other, you get a curve which includes classical and non-classical nonlinearity. So you see this drop that you have been seeing. You see these oscillations. And there is also a recovery. I'm going to talk about that. I also quickly want to mention that this is not the only way you can use these kinds of experiments. You can use surface wave probes. We have done that. You can use Coda wave probe. So I've seen that you all show Coda waves, so I decided I also show this. So you see that I've done Coda wave analysis. You can also use Coda wave analysis. But remember that when you are using Coda wave analysis, this change of velocity is basically looking at the strain is being averaged during the time that the wave is propagating. So you're losing a lot of resolution. If you are working in a lab like we do, we want to make sure we have resolution, we understand. So that's why we don't use it all the time, but it's possible. And right now, we are also using a thermal pump. So instead of mechanical pump, we are using a shot of thermal pump as the pump. Hopefully, you are going to see these papers later this year. Now, how do we do that? How do we calculate this wave speed? Because all of you use Coda wave, and you told me that in the beginning, sometimes you don't see any changes. I thought, to show that actually there is change. So it's very slight, and it's as expected. Remember that I told you the tension phase is slower than the compression. It's very, very tiny, but you can still see it. And we can extract it from coherent wave, not from Coda. And you can get the time shift. We also look at the amplitude change. Also, I'm not going to show any of that today, but we typically look at the amplitude too. And the trick that we use to be able to see the velocity change is that when we get the cross-correlation curve, we fit a polynomial to the peak. And we pick the maximum at that polynomial. If you just get the maximum of cross-correlation, I agree with you. You won't see any changes. But if you do this little trick, you see everything that I'm showing to you here. So it's possible to do that and just use coherent wave. So how does the result look like? This is a typical result in Berea sandstone. You see we have the oscillations. The velocity drops, oscillates, and then recovers. If I plot the wave velocity change versus a strain, in this part, I'm going to get this kind of a shape. And we have a method to fit this. I'm not talking about the details of it, more intuitively. How far this is below 0 relates to alpha. What the slope of this is related to beta. What the curvature is, it relates to delta. We can quantitatively get this out. And how does it look like if we change the amplitude of a pump? So here you see from 1 to 10 microstrain. There was a discussion a couple of days ago. It looks like 1 microstrain is kind of a magic threshold. So below that, it's very small. And as you increase the amplitude, you're going to see this effect. And you see that the shape changes a little bit here. So how do we use this information? First, the fast dynamics. How do we use that? It turns out that it tells us a lot about the microstructure of rocks. So this is where we applied this method to many different rocks. And then we clustered them blindly. And we were able to see that the rocks which have a lot of microcrack, like granite, they fall into one category, and the rest fall in the other category. So it tells us something about the mechanisms behind beta, a classical nonlinearity parameter, and the rest. We think that beta is more related to opening and closing of the cracks. The rest, like hysteretic nonlinearity, it's more about sliding of the cracks. It's much less related to the opening and closing of the crack. When you look at the frequency-dependent behavior of these different parameters, you see that. So here, this is Beria sandstone. You see that beta is the only one which is frequency-independent. So this is another experiment which we did. Actually, a part of it was done at ENS in Paris, where we looked at different frequency dependency, and beta doesn't seem to depend on frequency, but the rest do. So that was another, these are only just some indications that what the mechanisms could be. And I know that fast dynamics is not as interesting for this community than slow dynamics. So we also looked at slow dynamics very carefully. If you look very carefully inside these measurements, you actually have 6 different regions. So you have the beginning, where you have no excitation. Then you pump up. And this is when you have this sudden drop. And then you have these oscillations in the middle. Then you have a ring down at the end. And then afterwards, you have this slow recovery. Sometimes we call the first part fast recovery, the second part slow recovery. So this is from a paper in 2017, where we fit these recoveries with a collection of exponentials. So we saw that they are not completely time logarithmic. People in the past, they didn't have enough resolution in their measurements to see it. But with these kinds of measurements, we were able to see that we were kind of wondering whether this is really time logarithmic, as we would think. At later time, it becomes time logarithmic. But it turns out that if you fit a number of exponentials, you're getting this characteristic time spectrum that you see at the bottom, how this characteristic time, the amplitude is changing. And I think the most important figure in that paper is that when you change the relative humidity of Beria sandstone, this characteristic curve doesn't change. So the shape doesn't change, which is quite remarkable, because you can see the amount changes a lot. Everything scales, but it looks like this characteristic times this exponentials, these time characteristics times don't change. So it's something that is interesting to us to see. I haven't got any questions, so I'm worrying. But anyway, I have a question for you very soon. This is the measurements that we have done, not under stress. But then we started doing measurements under a stress and saturation condition. So we have intact and fractured samples. We also use the calibration sample. I'll tell you why in a second, still. And we apply different stresses. So in terms of a state, we have dry intact, dry fractured, and saturated fractured. And I regret that we didn't have saturated intact, but we didn't. So what do you think between dry intact and dry fractured, which one has a higher nonlinearity? That's what we thought too. And between dry fractured and saturated fractured? Saturated has a higher? Dry should have a higher. That's what you would expect. So these results were a little bit surprising. The experimental device that we have, I think, is quite unique. Probably we are one of the maybe only or few labs that have this possibility. You have seen the biaxial deformation apparatus at Penn State, I think in Chris Maroon's work. But we added ultrasonics to it heavily. So we have a vessel which goes inside this biaxial setup, and we can control the normal stress, shear stress, confining pressure. We can also measure permeability and change pore pressure. We can oscillate normal stress, pore pressure, everything. So we developed this setup. It took a couple of years, but we developed this setup to study nonlinear elasticity under in situ conditions. Inside this, I have a little bit, so this is how the load setup looks like. This is inside. So you see an L-shaped sample inside a jacket. This is the L-shaped sample. This is the jacket. And then it's being sandwiched by 2 platens. And each platen has a lot of sensors. We have 12 and 9. And this is all inside. We can insert this into the biaxial deformation. And then we have some sort of rain showers at the bottom and at the top and bottom. So we have a linear kind of, we can basically change the pore pressure. We can send the fluid in and out. So we can do, and we have the possibility to do both active and passive and hybrid active-passive experiments. So we use this measurement on these L-shaped samples because we can also shear. That's why they are L-shaped samples. And we have the possibility to change the effective stress. So we can either oscillate the normal stress, and we can also oscillate the pore pressure. If you look at the papers, there are results on pore pressure oscillations. I'm not showing those here because I only have 45, 50 minutes. But we have this possibility, and it would be nice to collaborate if anyone is interested. In any case, we developed this setup to study these phenomena under stress saturation conditions. So the first thing we did, we tested the still sample. The reason is you have a lot of interfaces which induce nonlinearity. So if you apply a stress, so on the top we are applying this time a stress, not a strain pump. If the system is completely linear, which you want it to be, you should get a straight line, no velocity change. Remember, velocity is a strain independent, right, if material is linear. The same with amplitude, which is at the bottom figure. We see a little bit for a steel, but if you compare it to the rock, it's orders of magnitude smaller. So that gave us confidence that our system is not adding too much nonlinearity into the material. So that was check number 1. Then we had an experimental protocol. I already told you about these different states. But we had this stress protocol. So you see we have oscillations at different amplitudes, also different frequencies. So what you see at the bottom are these normal stress oscillations we are applying. And during this time, we are probing with these ultrasonic transducers. The results, just a snapshot of one experiment, looks something like that. So you have these oscillations. You do all those tricks to get the wave velocity changes. Amplitude, we also measure permeability, as I said, which I'm not showing. It looks something like that. From those, we extract these parameters. And it's important for the rest of, for the last few slides that these parameters you remember. One is this drop in wave velocity, which I call delta C with a big delta. One is this change in amplitude of wave velocity, and the other is this recovery rate. So let's see if our hypothesis is correct. My hypothesis was exactly like you. I thought if we plot the delta C over C, so these plots are overwhelming. I know we are looking at wave because it's a lot of data. We are looking at wave velocity, y-axis. X-axis is oscillation amplitude. So we see how much the wave speed is changing with amplitude. So the larger this change is, means higher nonlinearity. Like you, I expected to see a higher nonlinearity for the dry fractured. As you can see, this is not the case. In all the normal stress levels, varying degrees, the intact has a higher nonlinearity. That was the first surprise. And because we have so many data, it's so repeatable, and we had 2 different samples. I'm not showing the same thing. And then the second surprise was when you compare the saturated versus dry, you expect the saturated to be less nonlinear. That means these curves should be shifted up, right? It does at 15 and 20. It doesn't at 10 megapascal. Interesting. It doesn't. You also, these different markers show different frequencies. You see that frequency plays a role. So frequency is important. There was the previous talk, they were talking about frequency dependency. This is an important parameter. For this drop, it's a question. Yes, please, Peter. The frequency are these different markers. So the blue is 10 hertz. The two squares are 1 hertz, and the diamond is 0.1 hertz. That was your question? Yeah, there is a lot of data here. Every one of those points is one oscillation. It's a lot of data. Thank you for asking that so that I clarify. So we see this frequency dependency. And if you look at the amplitude of oscillation of frequency, which I know in the field, this is not what you can measure. But for us was a check to see, this is related to beta. I don't know if you remember from this short talk, this beta should be frequency independent. It looks like it is the case. Things are a little bit more collapsed. And the same thing. We see exactly the same behavior, which is another check. And we have seen this a lot here. These measurements are not very, the resolution is not such that we fit a lot of exponentials like we did in other measurements. So we just looked at the logarithmic rate, and it's a little bit, oops, it's a little bit less, what happened? It's a little bit more scattered, but you see the same thing. Intact, more nonlinear than fractured, and then saturation seems to be interacting with the stress. So they are both important and they are interrelated. So our explanation, this is published, I hope it's correct, was that when we ran a simulation, so in our test configuration, we ran a simple simulation to see what's going on. It looks like when you have a fracture, when you press the same amount, it looks like you get a lot more strain, as you expect. At the contacts, you have a stress concentration, but the body is not as much a strain. Our interpretation was maybe because the strain is all concentrated in contacts, and the contacts are so much fewer than the whole body of the sample, maybe this is why we see less nonlinearity when you are fracturing. But honestly, this was a big surprise. We searched our source and our data for a long time before trying to explain it. So this is published in a journal called Journal of Physics, JMPS, Journal of Mechanics and Physics of Solids. I don't know if this community reads that, but this is, all this study is there. And then why do we see less nonlinearity? Yeah. Sorry. Oh, there is a question. Great.
For the difference between the intact and fractured dry samples, would it make sense to check the absolute velocities? Because we've only looked at the velocity variations, and looking at those, nonlinear effects are only in the change of those velocities. But would we, for example, expect for the fractured sample to just have lower velocities?
It does. So this is a very good point. You are saying that the denominator maybe is smaller, that's why it makes it larger. Was that your question? I think so. Yeah. So this is a very good point. And this is in the discussion of the paper because we thought about it. So we have measured, of course, the absolute velocity. When you account, it doesn't explain the amount of change. So the change is just because of the change in C0 is just a tiny bit. We actually discussed that. This was one of the first things we looked into that. But this is a very great observation. And it makes me happy because it seems like you are following. So I'm very happy to see that. Odile, please.
I have a question about
Yes, the pump is always the same. This is an extremely controlled setup. It's a very lucky situation. Yeah. Everything is the same. And we see the same thing and these measurements, each one of these cycles takes days. So there are different days, but we control everything. Yes, that's a good point, but yes, please.
In the previous slide where you showed that the fractured one is having less non-linearity as compared to the intact one, it's a biaxial compression setup, right?
We just use one direction, yes. Mm-hmm.
Right? So I'm just wondering that if we have the same fracture in the diagonal way, will we be observing the same thing? I mean, is the orientation of fracture going to affect this observation?
This is a great point. The answer is I'm sure that the orientation matters a lot because it's going to change the strain distribution. It's going to change everything. It's definitely a factor, but the normal stress, and it's perpendicular to this fracture plane in this particular case. And that's why in the beginning I said in our test configuration. So this is not a general statement that something is fractured is going to be less nonlinear under stress. This is in this particular test configuration. This is our observation. However, it shows how important this is because you may try to interpret something and the only reason may be because the stress is different and saturation. So any other questions? I'm so happy. So this is Richard.
Do you expect very different behavior if you use an intact rock but saturated?
I said in the beginning, I regret very much that we did not do saturated intact. However, other people have done that. So the nonlinear behavior of dry and saturated intact rocks are pretty well known, well understood. Yeah. Typically, you expect less nonlinearity because the pores are being filled with water, which is incompressible. So if it is about changing something inside the material, it becomes more difficult. You have more stiffness, so you are getting less nonlinearity. Pretty established, but I really wished that we had done intact saturated. We didn't. So another surprising thing was here, as I showed you, that we have for 15 and 20, we have less nonlinearity. At 10, we have more nonlinearity when we saturate. No matter what measure we use, 2 different samples, always the same. So we also, something I didn't talk about, and there are lots of things about this experiment that I didn't talk about. We use these pressure-sensitive films to measure true contact area, or at least to get a sense of what it is. Of course, these are done at separate experiments. They are not completely transferable, but we did that. And we found out that at 10 megapascal, the contact is very small. It's like 10%. So our interpretation is this. So I have to explain this graph. Our interpretation is this. Nonlinearity of a fracture depends a lot on how open or closed it is. So if you look at first the red curve, which is dry. So if the cracks are, we expect this kind of a shape. If the crack is very open, you can't change much by oscillating it or modulating it. If it is very closed, you also can't do much. So at high and low normal stress, the nonlinearity is pretty low. And we have some sort of a sweet spot in the middle. Now what happens when you add saturation? Our interpretation is that saturation adds to a stiffness as if you translate this curve up, like in the blue curve. So the 20 megapascal becomes more stiff and much harder still to open. The 15 also becomes more stiff, so the nonlinearity, it goes towards the low nonlinearity. It kind of goes up. But the 10, it looks like, in our case, 10 has been somewhere that the nonlinearity was pretty low. But then when we added moisture, we were actually able to maybe oscillate it under fracture. Again, this is an interpretation. It's not a proof. But we think maybe that's why the nonlinearity increased. Yes, please. Fully saturated. No. It's because it's then very hard to see. It's inside this vessel. It's really hard to control and see where it is saturated or not. But it would be interesting. Mm-hmm. But these are all the same saturation, just at different normal stress levels. Mm-hmm. That's a good point. And partial saturation is very difficult to understand, and it's an important topic, but that's not what we were able to work on. So then we looked and found a paper from 1979 where they show how the nonlinearity changes with this non-dimensional parameter, which is the aperture. So we hope that our interpretation is not very wrong. I don't know how I'm with time. I'm almost done. So just to summarize, basically, this is summarizing what I just told you about under stress. Some interesting, the take-home message is stress and saturation are very, very important in interpretation. I know you work in the field and your situation is very complicated, but you always have a stress and saturation. So these are something to think about. Even in our simple experiment, you see how complicated it is. So I hope that I gave you something about the principles. I really hope that you will remember DAT from this talk. And I hope that these in situ conditions at least raise some questions in your mind, what is going to happen. Very quickly, a couple more newer things. So this is a really recent paper. We are also working on granular media. So we have been able to do DAT on glass bead samples. Why do we do that? Because we want to understand these processes, recovery and fast dynamics. So this is how the setup looks like. Using the same machine, we are now using the vertical piston for oscillations. I don't want to show you so much details. I just want to show you the effect of relative humidity. So the more red is more dry, the more blue is more, just the relative humidity, not saturation. It has an enormous effect on nonlinear elastic behavior of materials. And we are doing now measurements. So our plan is, I disclose it, we are doing measurements on sand. We don't see that much effect. It looks like the interlocking of the grains doesn't let the grains to move that much. And then the plan is to then use sintered glass, which is kind of a cemented glass beads, and compare. Basically, we want to study the effect of cementation very carefully. Sorry that I don't have the pictures for the recovery that you are probably more interested in. But we are also looking to understand the mechanisms of all these observations. I know there was another talk who I think we are doing parallel things. We have developed a setup that you can put it in an X-ray machine. It's an aluminum X-ray transparent system. We can also do at the same time nonlinear ultrasonic testing. So with the PZTs in contact with the sample, this is how it looks like. And a similar setup for bringing to the synchrotron. What we want to do is to do nonlinear elastic measurements while watching our samples to see the process of healing, what is exactly happening. And that's kind of what some of the things that we are doing. I really appreciate your attention, and please, if you have any questions. Thank you so much.